stand by. This live webcast is now about to start.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's webcast. Is your mobile app too slow? 5 best tips for mobile immediacy. And with the panel that we have for you today, I think we might get through a lot more than just 5 best tips. Today's webinar is brought to you by VentureBeat and Akamai. Our big thanks to Akamai for helping us to bring this event to you today. Akamai have had no control over the content whatsoever. It remains completely editorial, so we thank them for allowing us to bring this content to you. Just a few things before we get started. I'm Stuart Rogers, Director of Marketing Technology with VentureBeat. I'll be your moderator today, and we just have a few announcements. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You should have seen a slide automatically advance already. You can also download a copy of the slides and, by the way, an awful lot of other goodies via the attachments section. There's some good things in there from Akamai. There's the presentation itself, and there's all the contact details of our wonderful panel. Now, if you are experiencing any technical problems whatsoever, please visit our help guide by clicking on the help link in the Rate This box. And we're going to have all sorts of interactive elements for our live viewers today, and thank you so much to everyone who is watching live. We're going to have a poll, and we're also going to have a Q&A session. With the Q&A session, you just simply type your question into the Ask a Question text box. You'll find that below the video window, and then click the Ask a Question button. And at this time, we also recommend that you disable any of your pop-up blockers. So, on to today's presentation. Is your mobile app too slow? 5 best tips for mobile immediacy. I'd like to just introduce our guests before I get into setting the scene, and then after I've set the scene, we're going to get into a number of questions with our fantastic panel. Discussing today's topic, we have David Holtkamp, CEO at Crimson Moon. We have Jonathan Maison, CEO at Visual Blasters, and we have Martin Dominguez, the CIO at Etamax. As I say, I'm Stuart Rogers with VentureBeat, and I'm just going to set the scene for you now, and then we'll get into the first set of questions with our awesome panel. So let's just take a look at some data. In terms of the research that we're going to be using and some of the content that we're going to be providing you, that comes from our research arm. We have a research arm at VentureBeat called VB Insight. You'll find VB Insight at insight.venturebeat.com. Now, we have been analyzing the marketing technology world now at VB Insight for around about the last 4 years. As well as marketing technology, we have also done a lot of research on the video game industry, and particularly in mobile games, with regards to things like mobile user acquisition, mobile marketing automation, monetization, etc., etc. We've tried to run the full gamut as far as marketing technology and mobile gaming is concerned. Now, the way that we do our research is maybe a little bit different to some of the other research firms. We don't allow vendors to sponsor our research in advance. We don't allow anybody to set questions. We don't allow anybody to decide what topic we're actually going to research. We use data to decide which topics we're going to research, and we look for the trends, the things that people care about right now. And then when we research a topic, we use 2 broad buckets of data. We use small data and big data. Small data for us is kind of thing where we might survey 3,000 conversion rate optimization users, or we might survey 2,000 social media marketing managers. We're not talking about very small data here. We're talking about seriously statistically significant data. And big data for us is really big. When we analyzed the ad tech industry, we had a data partner give us 18 billion ad impressions for us to work through. When I looked at the state of marketing technology, I had a technology partner scrape 3.2 million US business websites and align that data with industry and staff numbers and revenues. So you can see we work with small data, we work with big data. We put those two together, and sometimes they line up, and that tells a nice story. Sometimes they don't line up, and guess what? That tells a nice story too. The point is, we tell the story from the point of view of data and data alone. You'll find all of that over on VB Insight. It's well worth going and taking a look. Now, let's have a look at mobile immediacy. First things first, there are a lot of apps out there. Mobile is fast-paced. It's easily the most competitive marketplace ever to exist. It is as far-reaching as you can possibly get. We're heading into a world where by 2020 it's estimated that there'll be 6 billion smartphones in use. That's almost one smartphone per person, which is quite remarkable. But just how competitive is it? Well, if we look at the very latest data pulled from Apptopia in June 2017, you can see that there are more than 3.1 million apps available on the iOS App Store, and there are over 4 million apps available on Google Play. Some of these are games. The games percentage in terms of how many of these apps are games is typically hovering somewhere around about the 17 to 22% mark. The rest are apps. We have all sorts of different types of app available, but the point here is that when you look at the amount of submissions that there are every single month, it's clear that this is an incredibly competitive space. And when there's an incredibly competitive space, you have to do everything humanly possible to make sure your app is getting seen, because otherwise it's just not going to get downloaded. It's not going to give you the return on the investment. And the investment in producing good apps and good games is actually pretty significant. So if you're not doing everything that you possibly can to make sure people see your app, download your app, and use your app, and don't uninstall your app, then you're going to lose out. In fact, that's the biggest thing that we see when it comes to mobile. It is an extraordinary marketplace, and anyone that's got a startup out there can relate to looking at the size of the opportunity and just thinking, well, look, if we could just get 1% of all of those users, we're going to be millionaires. But it's really painful for mobile developers. It's really, really painful. It's especially painful when we see stories about 12-year-old whiz kids who make an app and rake in 10 million and retire before they're 15 years old. But that's just the 0.01%. The fact is, though, 95% of developers are not living the dream. Only 5% are making more than $50,000 per month. And with production costs being $300,000 and above in a lot of cases, that is very painful. In other words, mobile is a normal marketplace, just like every other marketplace that came before it. The winners are going to win big, losers are going to lose big. The top 1% of apps, the creme de la creme, are getting 35 times more sessions per day than the top 5%. They have 20 times the lifetime value. They have 9 times the conversion to paid rate, and they have 8 times the average revenue per day per user. So, when we look at people getting the app into their phone, of course we want them to keep it there. And one of the interesting things is if we look at Quetra's data, we can see that the average app is losing 77% of its daily active users within the first 3 days after the install. Within 30 days, it's lost 90% of its daily active users. Within 90 days, over 95% gone. That's pretty stunning and not in a good way. The other way to say this is that the average app mostly loses its entire user base within a few months, which is why of the more than 4 million apps in the Google Play Store, only a few really have any meaningful traffic and sustain that. And part of that is down to slow speed. If we look at the OpenEBG and Testapic barometer, the 3 reasons users uninstall your app or game are slow speed, intrusive ads, and lack of interest. And of course, slow speed is the thing that we're going to talk about today. We've talked about already just the phenomenal opportunity that there is in mobile, whether it's apps or games. We've talked about some of the dangers and some of the issues in terms of getting your app found. But of course, if people don't keep your app after they've found it, then it was all for naught anyway. And slow speed is the #1 reason that users are uninstalling your app or game. So that's what we want to address today. And we want to address that bearing in mind that we still want to provide our users with rich content. If you have a game, you want it to look good. You want it to be a great experience. So how do you address that balancing point between keeping the speed of the app high, making sure the download size is small? We'll talk about download sizes later. We'll focus on speed for the first section. But at the same time, continuing to provide that rich content for your audience. So that's the scene set. Those are the things we want to talk about today. Before we get into our first question for our wonderful panel, I just want to open up the poll, and we're going to start this poll for everybody. Now, you can see the poll. It's just below your video window. The question is for our audience, our live audience, and thank you once again for being with us. Are you aware of the speed and download size of your apps and, by the way, your mobile web pages, because we'll talk about that today too. Your possible answers are yes, and I'm seeing good results. Yes, but I need help. No, but I know we need to. No, and I'm not sure why we have to. Or something else. And if it's something else, please go down to the question box underneath your video window and pop in what that something else might be. Give us a little bit of background and color to that. So live audience, please just drop below the video window there, take a look at the poll and click away and give us your answers. Whilst you're doing that, let's get into this first question. Just how do we balance rich content and speed? Jonathan, I'll come to you first.
Hello, thanks for having me. So for us, with two apps that we've done, we started with the basic core features of our apps. So they were, slim, and they had an acceptable performance to them, and that's how we went out to the market, and that's how we began our apps with not too much stuff going on, just to test the water, see if things were going well. And based on feedback from users and everything, we concentrated on trying to see how we can bring in more features to our apps and do it in a way that yes, brings more rich content, but at the same time it doesn't lower the performance of the app. Because, users generally, if they're using an app, and it's performing well, and then you do a new update and they realize, like, oh, this is not working that well, you're going to get an uninstall right away, and you're going to get a 1-star rating, so that kind of hurts your app and your stats on the App Store. So that's kind of the approach that we did to balance rich content and speed. It began, with a slim, well-polished initial release, and then add to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is there a particular baseline, do you think? Is there is there a starting point that makes sense for the people that are listening to this today?
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, is there like a really good baseline in terms of that balance between speed and quality? Somewhere that everyone should start, or do you just have to figure it out and iterate as you go along?
I think that speed, obviously, for us, especially, it's very important, and then goes the rich content. So it's kind of like, how do we make this content work the best? And for us, like app sizes, generally between the 20 to 40 megabytes, it's kind of like our sweet point for app size. Our apps are not games; they're more like a streaming radio app, and then we have a drawing app for animation. So that's kind of like our size balance to the app.
Excellent, thank you. And David, same question to you. How do you think our audience should balance rich content and speed?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's two things that I think of when I approach this question. One is that you can either improve your engineering, or you can also entertain the user as it goes on. So, obviously, when you're talking about device, you have to think about what sort of devices you're targeting. If you're targeting high-end Apple devices, you can put a lot more content in there. But regardless, these two tips, I mean, taking the other factors into account. So for instance, on our splash screen, our loading was mainly going on in the background, and because it was Apple devices, and not to get too technical, but you could actually load the graphics on the back end in OpenGL versus Android, where a lot of devices can't do that. We actually entertained them by having falling bullets that they could actually interact with, and we even went so far as actually adding an achievement into our loading screen that the user could find. So I think you can do a lot. You'll see this also by adding tooltips in. So, I mean, if you look at Supercell's games, they do this as well. If you have a game that has a lot of complex features and things that people have to figure out, similar to our most recent title, Eigenpro 2, there's tons of buried features. And so if you're giving them useful information and engaging them, you can actually afford to put more engaging content in it as well, because you can afford that extra load time without causing churn, because the user's engaged. And I think also on top of that, putting some sort of, don't just show a loading screen or a loading bar and have that be it. Have some engaging content up there, so a cool screenshot. And like I said, on our first title, we could afford animations. On our second title, based on the change in the graphics engine, we can't, but so we decided to render out a really cool picture along with the tooltips. And then obviously there's the engineering things you can do, such as making sure that everything you're doing is parallelized. So if you have some network calls you have to do beforehand, be sure you're not waiting for those network calls to come back before you start loading your graphics in the back end. So we are still in the process of doing a complete optimization on that, but we've made some big strides, and I would say those are my two tips.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And Martin, same question to you. How do you balance rich content and speed?
Well, hi, thanks. I have mostly the same thing that David said. We have a lot of, at first our application was actually really small, but as far as start growing, we saw a lot of asset needed in our app, and we have the same problem. It's like you need to give to the user some content. You need to move the attention of the user, perhaps not to the loading itself, but to other things. We don't have explicitly a game. That's a really good idea, David, actually. I think we can steal that from you. But it's really how he said that move the attention of the user to another part of the application, not to the waiting. No one likes to wait in any kind of place. And I think perhaps we need, in our case, for example, we use most engineering in order to get the app smaller with smaller assets, and we implement at the same the background downloads for the asset if needed. For example, it's a really good practice to understand what device is that the user device, and just download the asset specifically for that user or the content that that user needs. It's usually a bad practice. Just have a big bunch of application with all the assets and just let the application decide when it says, oh, okay, I have this. But we mostly use the same techniques. We make sure, of course, that the download speed it's good. Usually make a lot of improvements when we, of course, use compression on our content. That's actually really important, but not only for this, but for any kind of thing that you need to move from one place to another, of course. But mostly it's the same experience for us. It's giving the user another kind of thing to do while he's waiting, and not making the user think that he's waiting, but trying to think of that as any other thing, any other way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the very interesting things I think is, we'll talk about file size in a moment. That's going to be the next section. But in terms of speed, what is your sense? What is your experience, Martin, of the sort of break points or the tipping point where a typical app user is going to just go ahead and uninstall if it's taking too long for the app to load? Is it 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds? At what point do people just get so annoyed that it's taking too long to load the app that they just go, do you know what, this is not worth my while, I'm going to uninstall?
You know, I just have that problem when I was at lunch like 30 minutes ago, and I was waiting for an app to load, and I just have that same problem. And in my personal experience, I think you start thinking, what am I doing here? When you start at the 3 seconds, you start realizing that you are actually doing nothing with the app on the 5 seconds. And I think if it takes more than 20 or 30 seconds to load, you just have a lost case in that matter. It's like, okay, that's for me. Perhaps I can do it later. Perhaps I can forget about the application. And as you know, I live in Argentina, so our download speeds are not quite good. I myself I don't download anything on the 3G or GSM network. I usually wait until I am on a Wi-Fi network to download the application or whatever I need. So it's really important to give the user something in those seconds. But I think in my own personal experience, you start thinking, what am I doing here at the first 5 seconds of the waiting time?
Yeah, how do you feel about that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think the threshold for when it starts to annoy someone is going to depend a lot on, how it's presented, as I said before, the splash screen. And really my criteria, probably nobody uses the app as much as the people that are developing it. And you just have to ask yourself, is this annoying me or is it, entertaining? And what I find is usually internally, if the team hates it, then it's probably too long. I mean, you're a user of the app as well, so I would use your judgment and think, okay, what else could I do to spice this up, or what else could I do to offload something? And that's one thing I forgot to say on the previous is also you can take in lazy loading. So if you have a screen, you can determine, okay, how much do I actually need to load now, and what can I wait to load later? And if you have that ability in your engine, I think that's important too. But back to your original question, I think it comes down to what annoys you, and then also you always want to have your finger on the pulse of the analytics. You really need to filter through your 1 stars, and I realize if somebody uninstalls right away, that you're not going to see that in the reviews. You might occasionally, but the people that usually take time to put the reviews is people that like it. So if you're looking through your 1 and 2 stars, or 1, 2, and 3 stars, and you see anything about load time, I mean, that's obviously a huge red flag that somebody who actually likes your app is getting annoyed at you. And that's probably a lot harder on Android. We usually target iOS first. But with Android, you never know what sort of phone they're using. You might have amazing load time on yours, but you don't know what your other users are seeing unless you actually go through and bother to talk with them. Surveys are always a huge help if you can integrate a survey API to ask them, hey, what do you think about the load times, and give them a place where they can put a comment. So yeah, I would say just soliciting feedback, but initially when I'm designing the product, I just take my own tuition and then also the intuition of the team who's developing it, because they have to see it 1,000 times a day as they're debugging.
Yeah, very, very good points there, especially with regard to the breadth of the Android device market. Jonathan, what have you got to add to that before we move on?
I was actually going to mention the lazy loading that David mentioned. We do a lot of that with our app Flip-a-Clip, because we have to load a lot of assets and raster images. They're fairly big, and we believe in giving our users a seamless experience. I know it's very different than the way that games have to load so many other things, but we do a lot of lazy loading so that when they click a project and they open that, immediately they see something that has loaded and they can begin drawing, while other parts of the app are getting instantiated, created, and loaded that are not necessarily necessary right away. So lazy loading for us did wonders and making things seem really fast when their devices might be slow. Like also David mentioned that Android, there's so many different brands, and they're they can be the best and they can be also the slowest, and you can still struggle with low-end devices, but you can do your best optimizing with lazy loading and other methods.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, audience, for having voted in the poll. We'll stop the voting now, but let's read out the results, because it might just help us with customizing our answers as we go forward. So are you aware of speed and download side of your apps and mobile web pages? 28% of you said yes, and you're seeing good results. But 57% of our audience said they're aware of it, yes, but they need help. So we're really, really pleased to have you on the webinar today. Hopefully we're going to give you the help you need. 14% said no, but I know we need to, and hopefully we can give you some inspiration to get started as well. Thankfully, nobody has said no and not sure why we have to, which is great, because I would question why you're on a webinar about this topic, but there we go. So let's move on to the next part. And by the way, audience, we are seeing some great questions come in from you already. At any time, you can go down below the video presentation window. You can click on the Ask a Question button, and you can pop your question in there and hit Send Question. We're going to get into audience Q&A towards the end of this session. So pop your questions in now, and we will try to get to as many of them as we humanly can. Let's have a look at the next section, and we're going to talk about size, because size is important. And we're going to talk about the size of a particular app. I wanted to highlight a case study, a really interesting case study, and give you some reasons why the size of the app is actually incredibly important in concert with the speed of the app once you actually get it onto the smartphone. So what was quite interesting was the good people at Segment had some really cool test data. What they did was they bought an app. They acquired an app through some friends, I think at Y Combinator. If my memory serves me correctly, it was just one of your standard mortgage calculator apps. And the original app size was 3 megabytes. Very, very simple app. It had already lots of downloads and installs. It was doing well in terms of the daily installs and the monthly installs. And so what they did was they basically bloated the app. They wanted to test the results of bloating the app and seeing what it did to the amount of times the product was looked at versus the amount of times it was installed, and therefore the install rate to see what changing the app would do. I mean, they did all sorts of things to bloat it. At one point they had a designer just hide lots of graphics inside the app just to boost it for no reason whatsoever. You never saw these graphics. They were just hidden in there. The whole intention was just to boost the app as much as possible. They also did it via all sorts of SDKs, etc., etc. But you'll notice if you have a look at the screen there, and again, if you can't see that because it's too small and it's too fuzzy when you zoom it out, don't forget you can go to the attachments area and download this presentation. But you can see there that when it was 3 megabytes, the install rate was 138%. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but what you got there is page views, and then people are installing it, and then people are saying, hey, here's Mortgage Calculator, and you're getting that organic boost. When it was at 99 megabytes, the install rate dropped to 79%. Once you went over to 123 megabytes, there was a big drop to 56%. Now, partly that's because once you get to 101 megabytes on the iOS App Store, it basically insists that you use Wi-Fi at that point. It doesn't allow you to download it via 3G or 4G, which of course then gives people another reason, another barrier to entry, another reason to not install it, because it's going to pop up with that message and say, you need to be on Wi-Fi, and most people at that point will just say, do you know what, I'm not going to bother. So, in practice, around sort of 101 meg and above triggers the cellular download block. It depends. It's dependent upon the exact build. It's sometimes as much as 123 meg before you get that cellular download block. It's somewhere between 101 and 123. But certainly once they got to 150 megabytes of bloating this poor little mortgage app that they acquired, they were down to just a 44% install rate, which is pretty awful. And it shows you the impact in a fairly controlled environment of what the app size does to your install rate. When we think about install rates, one of the reasons we think about them so carefully is not necessarily from just a pure US perspective, but we also like to think about it in terms of, what it's doing elsewhere in the world where the download speeds might not be quite as good. Now, as I say, Akamai have no control over the editorial content of this. It's just that I found this interactive graph on the Telegraph, and the Telegraph had created this great interactive map actually using data from Akamai. You can see there that on this interactive map, and if you go to the Telegraph and find this interactive map of mobile download speeds, you'll see that you can actually hover over each country, and you can get the average download and upload speeds on mobile devices via 3G and 4G. And you can see quite clearly that, whilst there's a nice blue color across North America, and Scandinavia is outstanding in terms of the fastest, Russia is awesome, United Kingdom and Europe are great in terms of speed. Don't worry about Antarctica being incredibly good. It's just that's a skewed result because there just aren't enough mobile devices to actually give a decent result there, unsurprisingly. But you can see that if you're launching your app or game elsewhere in the world, even Australia, which has slower than usual, but certainly in China, South America, and definitely in Africa and across the Middle East, download size is going to cause a big problem for you. People will look at that and they will think twice about whether to download your app or game in the first place when they actually see the size of that app or game in the store. So, let's talk about that a little bit. And, we'll do this in reverse order this time. Martin, coming to you first, what are the dangers associated with global reach when it comes to things like the file size, and also, tie in some of your experience around the app speed as well. Let's talk about global reach for a moment.
Well, for global reach, of course, you need to have a content delivery network. When you plan to go on worldwide, of course, you need to have the content near the user. And it is worse when you don't know when you are going to explode in a matter of users. Perhaps in our experience, for example, we have a surge of users from Turkey, and we don't even knew Turkish at that moment because of the nature of our app. It's more for giving content, and the content is usually into the users. So of course, it was really, really helpful for us to have a content delivery network deployed who can give us the content to the user at the moment without any of our intervention to say, okay, we have to do this in this case. Then when we saw where the need of more bandwidth, of more reaching was detected, for example, in our case, and we made some modifications to have perhaps a better description for the app on Turkish. But usually, when I was hearing you on the prioritization of size on the application, that doesn't apply usually to games. But usually, when you want to download a big game, for example, if you have great graphics, you usually assume that the application is going to be a little bit fatter than the usual. For example, if you are going to see a 3D, if you want to have a 3D game, it's like you say, okay, I can wait for that. But of course, some ways it's better to have the download of assets when you already have the user hooked with the application. The other thing, as you will say, is when you have a cap on the download and perhaps you don't want the user that you are going to use a lot of his data plan for the download of the app, perhaps it's going to be bad for you on the reviews. That's usually my opinion. Perhaps it's good to say to the user, okay, we're going to use a lot of your bandwidth for this in this scenario.
Fantastic, thank you. Excellent answers. David, coming to you, same question. What's your experience there? What are the dangers, and what can our listeners do about it?
Yeah, good question again. I'm going to start off slightly disagreeing with Martin here. I do think that even with games, users do look at the file size. And I say this as a person who's always super cheap. When I'm buying my new iPhone, I'm like, I'll just go with the smallest file size. And I'm just that user that looks at that and says, okay, you know what? some games I'm not going to get just because the size is so big. So I do think even in a game scenario, it does make a large difference with the file size. Maybe in certain places people expect it, but I think you're also filtering out a certain demographic. Also, something which I'm not sure has really been addressed, with the file size, it's not only that initial download. It's not just, am I going to install it or not install it? What you'll also find is if you have a large app, and this applies to even if you do a post download. So even if you're getting your content off of a content delivery network afterwards, you're still going to get filtered to the top when the user gets their device full. So they're going to go in there and say, oh, crap, I'm out. I need to take this video, and I don't have any space left. Well, what's going to float to the top of that, 2 gig file that happens to be your app because you downloaded a bunch of junk you didn't need, you're going to get a higher uninstall rate just because you're taking up so much space on their device. So there is a big danger of that for the users that are, at their capacity of their device. Also, something that's kind of annoying that we dealt with in iGun Pro 1 is that on the iPhone, your assets can actually be flushed based on where you store them, and there's criteria that the App Store will enforce. If you store them in a certain place, the App Store will actually, the iOS will actually flush your assets off. And we've gotten a lot of angry users saying, hey, why do I have to re-download all my skins or re-download all my guns? And we even have a message in the app that pops up that says, hey, you're short on space, they deleted everything. But it's still a bad user experience. So it's very important. So on our new app, what we've done, I would not recommend this to anyone else, but we actually built our own graphics engine from scratch. And it's based a lot around multi-resolution graphics because we have a lot of places where we have to display things really, really small and really, really big. And so we actually dynamically say, okay, how big's your screen? And we can go anywhere from 4K graphics all the way down to just about the tiniest screen you can imagine because we actually have X1 through X16 graphics. So we make sure that we never make the graphics worse than their full resolution, but we never download more than they need. So really having, and I know that standard's kind of built into a lot of things now, but making sure that you're not downloading a larger size asset. So that might, in time for your engineering team, might be a little more work, but actually taking the time to separate out your small graphics from your large graphics in the end might, even though it's coming from a content distribution network like S3, it might lower your uninstall rate because when users go to say, hey, what's taking up all my space, your app isn't the one on top.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Before I go to Jonathan with that, Martin, did you want to just chip in back on that at all?
Well, yes, I understand. Perhaps it's true that perhaps the demographics makes the difference, and sometimes perhaps more of, for example, I want to give the example of my mother, for example, that she doesn't need what a file size, she doesn't know, what a file size is, so perhaps it doesn't even take it in account. It's true what you say that it's not really nice to the user when the iOS, for example, says that your device is full and you go to the user preferences and at the top of all these things you see your application that it's taking too much space. Of course, that's unpopular for everything. But, for example, in my phone, I have Facebook as one of the first cache content, use cache content, and we usually just, as you will say, flush the cache, and that's all. But yes, I have to say it's not really nice to be on the top of the list of things that you can delete to save space. I have to agree with you on that.
Excellent, thank you. And Jonathan, same initial question to you, but of course, feel free to chip in on anything that David and Martin have said, but, what are the dangers here associated with global reach and file size?
Yeah, I have a slightly different response to this. For me, the dangers of going global reach is the network connection, like how well the connections work, the latencies and the constant drop-offs, between towers, switch-offs, and also the Android fragmentation that gets worse the further you go out from, like the third world countries. Fragmentation gets really bad. And to go with the network connection, we have CL Live, which is an internet radio streamer app, and it needs a constant connection to provide the music to the user. And we see this used a lot all over the world, and these issues were a constant, emails that we received and feedback and 1 stars, and it was very hard to overcome that issue. But what we did is we took all the data that we had and we designed our own streamer, our own stream engine, which monitored the network connections and looked at that information, and also looked at drop-offs between towers. And we did a lot of work internally to reconnect and restitch the connection for the live radio stations. And simply doing this, it improved tons our reviews and our download strength. We were separated to the competition because we had something that worked a lot better, and our users could see, like, wow, and my streaming radio works a lot better in your app than all these other apps. And that, what we did there also resolved a lot of issues with the Android fragmentation, because you have a lot of APIs that everybody can see on all these different devices, but underneath, things are different, how these different manufacturers have coded it. And we saw tons of issues where, for our case, media playback, simply hitting the stop button would hold the application and freeze it, and then the app would crash, or the phone would simply restart. And these were problems from the manufacturers and not us, but people blamed us. So, with this stream engine, we rewrote how we connect to the network, how we do the stitching of the stream and the decoding process. And once we released that, all these issues were completely gone, and we were actually doing much better with just about any device that was out there. With iOS, you have a device, you have the same processor you expect that they're going to have, like the iPhone 5 or 6. But with Android, this is specifically an issue with global reach.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very good points. Thank you all. We're going to move into the next section and talk a little bit more about these topics from the point of view of the tools that we need to use here. But just a reminder for our audience, our wonderful, wonderful live audience, you can go ahead and ask a question at any point. We're going to get into the audience Q&A straight after this next run of questions. And you can do that by just going down underneath the video window, and you'll see the Ask a Question button. You can type it in there, hit Send Question. If you do that now, we'll get a chance to have a look at your questions and get our awesome panel to answer them just before the end of this webinar. Let's move into the next section, and what we want to talk about is how fast should an app respond. We also want to talk about not just apps, but we want to touch on mobile web a little bit here in this section too. But when you look at the research, and I've looked at a lot of different research on this topic. This one is from Dimensional Research. They asked thousands upon thousands of people, in your opinion, how fast should an app respond? And what we're looking at here is the vast majority of people think that an app should respond in 2 seconds or less. That's pretty scary. In fact, almost everybody is at the 4 seconds or less phase. People are only willing to wait more than 4 seconds. Around about 8.5% of people, will wait for that. That's not very much, and scale that up to the 290 plus million consumers in the United States, and then scale that up to the rest of the world. That's a lot of very impatient people who are not willing to wait a very long time for your app to respond. The same is true, of course, of the mobile web. Now, there's lots of different things that we can do to improve the situation. We have, caching, and we can use caching in lots of different ways. We can use compression. We can use optimization. You can use minification, elimination. There's lots of shouldn'ts here, isn't there? And we could also outsource. Elimination, for example, might be something like, I don't know, such as render blocking JavaScript and CSS in a buffer file content, for example. There's lots of different things that we can do here the key point here is we want you, our listeners, our live audience, and our on-demand audience to come away with a few ideas, a few tools, techniques, things that you can actually go ahead and do either today or tomorrow. So, whilst you're thinking of maybe a question to ask and popping that in the questions box, let's get into that. Thinking about that, Jonathan, what are the best methods, tools, techniques? What are the things that have really made a difference to you as far as improving the app or even a mobile web experience? Because obviously, you have to tell people about your app, and so I would imagine everybody's got a mobile website and wants to make that as optimal as possible too. So, what are the best methods, tools, and techniques? Jonathan, over to you.
So, I mean, for anybody, even getting started with mobile development and or they have a fairly new project, the basics, look at Android, what they provide with their lint checkup, or Xcode, with their product analyzer. They provide some awesome hints at removing assets and things that you're not necessarily using. They're just lingering there and putting some weight on your app. But some of the things that we've used a lot on our assets is this little library called immedi PNG. And this library, what it does, it actually grabs all the PNGs and looks at the best compression ratio that it can achieve using different settings. And we were able to see like a 20% decrease in all our PNGs on our projects. So that, automatically gave us a nice boost in slimming down the app. For our app, Flip a Clip, which is a traditional animation app where you draw each page to create an animation, there's a lot of raster images that are 1080p pretty much in size, and that's a lot of space that it uses on the user's device. So we had to come up with better compression techniques than the standard PNGs for that case. So we used some some open source projects like C Standard from Facebook, which is a great compression algorithm that they have, a library. And we used that to create our own image formats. And we saw huge speed increases in decoding the images and encoding them, because that's what we're doing constantly within the app, because the user draws and we have to compress that, store it back into file. So it also minimized the size of the files for the user. So then, their front-end uploaded with our app and their projects in that area. There's a lot of things you can do too to make the app slimmer, such as using SVG images, which they're getting much better on Android with the latest releases. But those are some of the key things I would recommend people doing now, to improve their apps.
Excellent. Thank you so much. David, what are your best methods, tools, and techniques?
Sure, yeah. I would reiterate what Jonathan's saying. I think PNG compression in today's world is a huge thing. We were using this web tool called TinyPNG, and it was probably the best performance I'd seen as far as being able to compress PNGs, which is a hard thing to do because it's supposed to be a lossless technology, but there's lots of tricks. And there's also tools you can use even if you want to continue using PNG that allow you to lose some of the detail in order to gain. So I think spending some time and figuring out what quality you need, and maybe for some applications, I don't think this is encouraged on iOS, but you could go to a JPEG, a lossy sort of compression format can help. And then obviously when you're talking about tools, AWS is great. And I guess if anyone's unfamiliar with that, Amazon Web Services, and just using CloudFront to lower your latency globally. That's something we've been using for a long time. Also, when you talk about web pages, if you're trying to lower web pages, or even if you're using the bundle on Mac, there's an application called Daisy Disk, and usually it's used for just examining your whole hard drive, and you see this sort of I don't know what that could be called, like a radiograph, where you can sort of see visually what folder is large and what inside that folder is large, and allows you to sort of drill down. We actually take our web distributions and our app package, and you can drop it in there and actually see visually, okay, what's actually taking up the most space, and is there something that we maybe forgot to compress? I've definitely caught a couple times where a PNG slipped through that was like 8 times larger than it should be. And then also you can kind of sort of to start to prioritize, okay, if I need to start getting rid of stuff, where am I going to see the best gains? And that works great for images, and it's also been really great when we're working with JavaScript libraries, because a lot of times, there's a dependency that has a dependency that has a dependency, and just going manually through all those folders to figure out, okay, why is this so big when this is a simple library? It's helped to sort of eliminate certain libraries and also figure out in places, okay, if we, write our own wrapper for this one function instead of using this library, we can lower the size by 30%. And I used to use a similar tool on Windows, so there are special disk analyzing tools on Windows, but Daisy Disk is a great one for Mac.
Excellent, thank you so much. And yeah, Martin, wrapping this up for us, what are the best methods, tools, and techniques?
Well, we use tiny PNGs as well for the same reasons. Actually, I think that it's one of the best tools for this kind of stuff, because you want to waste time in order to get the best compression, and you can make someone else do it for you. That's always nice for this kind of stuff, and you can concentrate on what you really want to give the best application and have the best thing. For texture, we usually use texture packer. It's really nice for us because we can use sprites to use all the collection of assets, and just not using or not wasting space in sprites that has the same thing. Texture packer gives you a lot of tools in order to organize the sprites and group animations and things that are really useful in order to shrink the application. And another thing that we use a lot is for the quality size and not having different resolutions, we use PDF images. Using shrinking, of course, the PDF, because at first the PDF usually it's not the best option, because usually it's really, really big, but when you use it on the right way, you can have a really nice asset which works in many resolutions without having a loss of quality. That's one of our tricks, perhaps, in order to give the best asset to the specific user and not having a lot of resolutions.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much. We have a whole bunch of questions in from our audience. We have a few minutes left to answer them. So audience, this is your chance to just get a final question in. Just pop underneath the video window. You can ask a question there. We've got quite a few in the hopper. We're going to get through as many as we can. And also, just before we get there, we do take your ratings and your feedback incredibly seriously. So if you would like to go and click on the Rate This button, you can give us a rating, and you can put in comments or suggestions in there to let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. We take that incredibly seriously. We'd love you to give us a rating as well as getting your final questions in. We've got a question here. How critical is app speed in countries with 4G? Hasn't that made speed a non-issue? Let me ask that to Jonathan first.
I mean, for me, in terms of app size, when it gets downloaded, obviously always keeping it as slim as possible. It's always a good idea, and plan for the worst. At least that's how I think. Plan for the worst, and when it's faster, it's it's even better for that user. Like these guys were saying, when the app is downloading and it's taking a little while, and you're at a lower speed, then you go and open Facebook, and then you forgot about that app, and you're not even going to open it because you were bored, and that's why you downloaded it. So it's size matters in the app, and the package should be as small as possible. If that's my thought on this.
Excellent. Yeah, David, is 4G made speed a non-issue, or is it still a problem?
Right. So on this question, I mean, I think it's important to differentiate file size and speed. So I mean, speed is always an issue inside the app. As far as file size, I mean, we see especially in the game industry, it seems like the file size continues to grow faster than the bandwidth. It used to be like on console, you're like, wow, this is a 2 gig game. Now when you get a game, it's like literally like 20 or 30 gigabytes downloading. So I mean, I think you're going to see the same thing with the mobile resolutions, the mobile graphics continue to improve. I think you're always going to see sort of a battle of how much content and how good and high resolution of textures can I get into this game. So I don't think it's a non-issue. And you can I always go back when I think about loading speed or just speed and quality of an app back to the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. He was asked, okay, what's going to change in 10 years? And he says, what's really important to think about is what's not going to change in 10 years. And what's not going to change is users are not going to start thinking, oh man, I wish this app, was a little bit slower when it started, or I wish this would take up a little bit more room on my device. So maybe it won't be as critical, but I think you're going to continue to see, people are going to want better and better quality graphics, and it's always going to be your best option to take that little bit of time to do the compression, to really, think about where do I need this size at. So no, I think it still matters.
And Martin, what can you add to this?
I think the same. I think it's worse actually when you have a lot of speed, because that's made an issue for you. In other times, for example, well, here in Argentina, we're still just going with 4G, so we already have 3G, and we have issues with 3G. But it's usually when the speed is really good, when the bandwidth it's not scarce, usually the user tends to blame you for any kind of thing that they can be. I think it's, as my other colleagues say, a really big issue. I think it's not a non-issue, but it gives you less room to make mistakes, I think. And if the user sees you in any other way different to another more optimized app, I think it's going to be noted in that kind of environment. And I think it's really the user. It's not going to think, oh, this is my carrier user. I have to have a better plan, or I have to wait until I have Wi-Fi. I think the user is going to blame you for that. And I think that's dangerous.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, panel. Just adding an analyst's perspective into this, I have to tell you that whilst the world does have 4G, LTE download speeds actually vary wildly. I remember some research on that from OpenSignal. Singapore actually tops the charts with an average of 37 megabits per second. I'm afraid the United States comes about 55th down the list with an average of 10 megabits per second. So yes, it still does matter in terms of the file sizes and everything else, because whilst 4G is something that we think of as a fast mobile data network, actually the vast majority of countries have an average download speed of less than 18 megabits per second. So you have to pay attention to it, I'm afraid. We've got time to ask one more question, I think, quickly, and this might be one where I ask the panel to sort of step up and just to say who can answer this, because it depends on your development environments here. But somebody here is asking, does using Swift, which of course is Apple's product, or React Native affect speed in iOS apps? Can any of our wonderful panelists answer that question?
I could take a stab at least at the Swift side. Swift is a very fast language. It's not as, obviously Objective-C, you're actually compiling much more directly down to assembly language, but at the same time, I think what it boils down to is, what are you doing? If you're building a graphics engine and you're in your core loop, of course you don't really want to use anything but C or C++. However, if you're just making an app and you're trying to make sure it's snappy, Swift definitely isn't going to slow you down. It's almost as fast as Objective-C, and I know at this point in time it might actually be faster. One thing I have seen people saying is it really doesn't matter that much also, because when you actually look at the Cocoa APIs you're calling into the same APIs regardless of what language you're using. So you're not really going to slow yourself down. So if you're worried about speed and you're not building a game interface, I really wouldn't be worried too much about the language unless you're like doing image processing or something.
Excellent, thank you. Anything to add, Martin or Jonathan?
No, I don't have experience with this Swift.
I don't program a couple of years ago, so I really don't have any other answers for that.
No problem at all. We've now reached that point, unfortunately, where we have to bring it to an end and make sure that our audience gets away in a timely manner. On behalf of our guests, David Holtkamp, Jonathan Messon, and Martin Dominguez, thank you so much for attending today's webcast. Is your mobile app too slow? 5 best tips for mobile immediacy, brought to you by VentureBeat and Akamai. And before we go, I would like to invite everybody to join us in San Francisco this July for MobileBeat 2016, where we'll be focusing on AI, bots, and mobile innovation with speakers from Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, Slack, and many, many more. We're giving viewers of this webinar a 10% off discount. You'll find the link in the attachments, and you just need to go ahead and use the promo code webinar10. That's webinar10. You can listen to this webinar again on demand at this location. And if you enjoyed today's event or have suggestions on how we can make it better, we'd love you to give us a rating. We take those ratings very, very seriously. Love hearing ways that we can deliver even better content to serve your interests. So I'm Stuart Rogers. I'm signing off for VentureBeat. This webcast is copyright 2017 by VentureBeat and Akamai. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that is the case, by VentureBeat and Akamai, who are solely responsible for content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. Thanks for your time, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
This live webcast has now finished. Thank you for taking part. A recorded version of this webcast will be available on this Bright Talk channel shortly. Please rate this presentation and provide the speaker with feedback using the ratings button. Also remember to share this webcast with anyone you think should see it using the share button. Today's presentation was brought to you by Bright Talk. As a Bright Talk user, you can find many more engaging webcasts to view at brighttalk.com. You can also manage your personal channel subscriptions, your profile details, and start a webcast channel of your own. If you have any comments or feedback on this viewing experience, please let us know by visiting www.brighttalk.com/feedback.